Every single morning, without fail, a delivery arrived at a flat in Bryanston Court, Marylebone, London. Not groceries, please do not post. Flowers. 17 of them. Always 17. Never 16, never 18. Sent by Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's personal representative in Britain, the most dangerous diplomat in Europe. And the woman receiving them was weeks away from becoming Queen of England. MI5 knew, the Prime Minister knew, the Cabinet knew, and every single one of them buried it so deeply that 90 years later, the relevant files at Windsor Castle are still sealed from public view. What you are about to hear is not a love story. It is not a fairy tale about a king who gave up his crown. It is a counter-intelligence emergency that the British establishment has spent nearly a century pretending was a romantic scandal dot. And today, we are pulling every thread until the whole thing unravels. If this kind of forensic royal history is what you're here for, please hit like and subscribe right now. This channel does not do fluff. We do files, receipts, and the truth that the palace would rather you never found. Let us begin at the beginning. Not with Edward, not with the abdication, but with the woman herself. Because to understand what happened in 1936, you have to understand who Wallis Simpson was before she ever set foot in a British drawing room. And the establishment absolutely did not want you looking too closely at that history. She was born Bessie Wallis Warfield in 1896 in Baltimore, Maryland. Not wealthy, not aristocratic. Not the kind of woman who was supposed to end up at the centre of a constitutional crisis in Britain. Her first marriage was to a United States Navy pilot named Earl Spencer. And this is where the documented history already becomes uncomfortable. Because Spencer was not a romantic figure. He was abusive and a severe alcoholic. And Wallis endured that marriage for years, before eventually divorcing him in 1927. But before the divorce, she was stationed with him in the Far East, Hong Kong, Shanghai. And it was during those years in China that biographer after biographer has noted certain gaps in the record that British intelligence later became extremely interested in. What we know with documented certainty is that by the early 1930s, Wallis Simpson had accumulated a social intelligence that was frankly extraordinary for someone of her background. She knew how to work a room. She knew how to make powerful men feel seen in a way that was almost operationally precise. Whether that was instinct or something cultivated, that is a question the files have never fully answered. What is documented is that she had a relationship with Italian fascist Count Galeazzo Ciano during this period. This is not tabloid speculation. Ciano would later become Mussolini's son-in-law and Italy's foreign minister. He was one of the most powerful figures in fascist Europe. And Wallis Simpson, before she was anyone of note, was sleeping with him. Multiple biographers have documented this. Anne Sever's meticulous 2011 biography, That Woman, goes into considerable detail. There is also the matter of an alleged pregnancy and a procedure that, according to multiple sources, left her unable to have children. This has never been definitively confirmed, but it is repeated by serious historians, not gossip columnists. And it matters to the wider story because it speaks to a pattern, a woman who moved through circles of extreme power, who formed intimate relationships with men at the apex of fascist Europe, and who left very little documentary trail of her own. By 1928, she had married her second husband, Ernest Simpson, a British-American shipping executive. Respectable, quiet, utterly unsuited to what was coming. They moved to London, and by 1931, Wallis Simpson had been introduced to the Prince of Wales. By 1934, she was his mistress. And by 1935, MI5 had opened a file on her. Now here is where most accounts of the abdication crisis stop being honest with you. The narrative you have been sold, the one the palace preferred, the one the establishment quietly encouraged, is that MI5 monitored Wallis Simpson because she was an inappropriate romantic attachment for the heir to the throne. A twice-divorced American, constitutionally problematic, socially unacceptable. That is the version. That is the cover story. The actual version, documented in declassified intelligence files, is considerably more alarming. MI5 was monitoring Wallis Simpson because they believed she was simultaneously conducting an affair with Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's ambassador to Britain, and that through that relationship, classified British state information was flowing to Nazi Germany. That is not a romantic complication. That is an active national security crisis sitting at the very centre of the British monarchy. Let us talk about Ribbentrop for a moment, because the full picture of who this man was makes the Carnations story land very differently than it might otherwise. Joachim von Ribbentrop was not some minor diplomatic functionary. He had been a champagne salesman before he reinvented himself as a foreign policy operator, attached himself to Hitler in the early 1930s, and became one of the Führer's most trusted international representatives. He was appointed German ambassador to London in August 1936, right in the middle of the Abdication crisis, as it happens, and he was vain, socially hungry, and absolutely determined to insert himself into British aristocratic society. He was also one of the most senior Nazis in existence. He would go on to become foreign minister in 1938. He signed the Munich Agreement. He signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And in October 1946, he was hanged at Nuremberg as a convicted war criminal. That is the man who sent flowers to Bryanston Court every single morning in 1936. The flowers themselves, 17 carnations, sometimes 17 roses, always 17, come to us from an FBI file. The source cited in that file is a Benedictine monk living in an American Franciscan monastery who told FBI agents that he had formerly held the title Duke of Württemberg and had been personally close to Queen Mary, Edward's mother. He told them the number 17 was specific. It was not random. It represented the number of times Ribbentrop and Wallis Simpson had slept together. Andrew Morton, who spent years combing through declassified FBI and MI5 material for his 2015 book 17 Carnations, found the claim plausible but not definitively proven. What he found impossible to dismiss was the totality of the evidence surrounding it. The recurring deliveries were documented. The personal contact between Ribbentrop and Simpson was documented. And British intelligence's assessment of that relationship as a national security threat was absolutely documented, in their own words, in their own files. And here is something that tends to get glossed over in the popular retelling. MI5's surveillance of Wallis Simpson did not turn up one inconvenient relationship. It turned up multiple times. By 1935, intelligence reports were noting that she was involved not only with Edward, not only with Ribbentrop, but with at least 2 other men. One was a married car salesman named Guy Trundle. Another was Edward Fitzgerald, the Duke of Leinster. This is not being raised to shame a woman who has been dead since 1986. This is being raised because it matters operationally. A woman simultaneously managing intimate relationships with the heir to the British throne and the Nazi ambassador to Britain during a period of acute international tension was not a woman whose private life was merely her own business. Henry Chips Channon, the Society diarist whose unredacted diaries were finally published in 2021, described Wallis explicitly as Ribbentrop's lover, and noted that Edward was being influenced through her, channeled through the Nazi-adjacent social network around the salonière Lady Emerald Cunard. Channon was there. He was in those rooms. He saw those people together. Now let us talk about what the British government actually knew, because this is where the counterintelligence emergency becomes a constitutional crisis in disguise. When King George V died on January 20th, 1936, and Edward ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was handed a problem that has almost never been honestly framed in mainstream historical accounts. The official problem, the one written into every school textbook, is that the new king wished to marry a twice-divorced American, which was incompatible with his role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The Church could not sanction the marriage. Parliament would not permit a morganatic solution. Baldwin presented Edward with a choice: give up Wallis or give up the throne. Edward chose Wallis. He abdicated on December 11th, 1936, and became the Duke of Windsor. Romance, sacrifice, love conquers all. That is the version. The version in the Cabinet Papers and MI5 files, later released to the National Archives, is this. Edward's red boxes, the confidential government documents that flow daily to the sovereign, were under active intelligence surveillance. There was substantive reason to believe that documents from those boxes were being read by Wallis Simpson, that she was extracting information from them, and that information from her was reaching Berlin through her connection to Ribbentrop. Stanley Baldwin was not merely managing a romantic scandal. He was managing a situation in which the sitting king's mistress was a suspected, active intelligence asset for Nazi Germany. The abdication was not primarily a constitutional crisis about divorce. It was a mechanism for removing a security liability from the most sensitive position in the British state. Read that again slowly, because the implications are extraordinary. The official story of one of the most famous moments in British royal history is, if the documented intelligence record is accurate, a cover story. A very convenient cover story that preserved the monarchy's reputation, allowed Edward to depart with some dignity, and buried the real reason he had to go under 60 years of romantic mythology. The paper trail that confirms this is not speculative. It exists. It has been examined by serious historians. Consider the handwritten note made by Alec Hardinge, the king's own private secretary, a senior Buckingham Palace courtier, a man whose job was to be precise and who would not commit things to paper carelessly. His note, recorded on an intelligence report concerning the Windsors during the war years, reads as follows. Germans expect assistance from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, latter desiring at any price to become queen. Germans have been negotiating with her since June 27th. That is a serving palace courtier, formally putting it on record that he believed the woman who had once nearly been Queen of England was actively negotiating with Nazi Germany for restoration to the throne in exchange for political collaboration. That note is in the archives. It is real. It has never been retracted. No one at the palace has ever explained it away. And then there is the FBI memo, September 13th, 1940. The FBI's London station sent a formal report to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, a man not known for filing exaggerated intelligence assessments, a man whose agency had very good reasons to be precise about what they put in writing. The declassified text, obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, states that an agent had established conclusively that the Duchess of Windsor had recently been in contact with Joachim von Ribbentrop and was maintaining constant contact and communication with him, and that because of their high official position, the Duchess was obtaining a variety of information concerning British and French official activities that she was passing on to the Germans. That is not a rumour. That is not a diary entry from a jealous courtier. That is an FBI field report, sent to the director of the FBI during an active world war, classifying the wife of a former British king as a functioning German intelligence asset. At this point in 1940, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were in Lisbon, having fled France as the Nazis advanced. And what was happening in Lisbon during those weeks is one of the most extraordinary and underreported chapters of the entire Second World War. The Nazi regime was running an active operation, known to historians now as Operation Willi, which aimed to either persuade or coerce Edward into remaining in Europe rather than taking up his posting as governor of the Bahamas, to which Churchill had effectively exiled him. The plan, in its most ambitious form, was to keep Edward available as a potential puppet king for a post-invasion Britain. And the intelligence picture that emerges from the FBI files, the Hardinge note, and the Marburg Files, the captured Nazi diplomatic documents, suggests that Wallis was not a passive bystander in these conversations. She was an active participant who had her own motivations and her own lines of communication back to Berlin. The Marburg Files. Let us spend a moment here. At the end of the Second World War, American forces discovered an enormous cache of captured German Foreign Ministry documents in a castle in the Harz Mountains. Among them were documents directly relating to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's communications with and attitudes towards the Nazi regime. The contents were so damaging that both Winston Churchill and the American government agreed to suppress them. A coordinated effort was made to keep them from public view. The files were eventually partially released in the 1950s under American pressure, but not before an intervention that has never been fully accounted for. King George VI, the man who had taken Edward's place on the throne, was sufficiently alarmed by what was in those files that he authorized a covert operation to recover the most damaging documents before American historians could properly examine them. And this is where the story becomes almost operationally cinematic, in a way that no fiction writer would dare to construct. The man sent to Germany in 1945 to retrieve royal correspondence on the king's authority was Anthony Blunt, the art historian, the surveyor of the king's pictures. The man who, it would later be established beyond all doubt, was a Soviet spy and a member of the Cambridge Five, one of the most destructive intelligence networks in British history. The British royal family sent a KGB asset to retrieve their most sensitive wartime documents. Whether the palace knew about Blunt's Soviet connections at the time is itself one of the great unresolved questions of 20th century intelligence history. What was in those documents? What did Blunt retrieve? What was destroyed? And what was taken back to Windsor? The files that remain at Windsor Castle relating to this period are still restricted. Not partially restricted, not available with redactions, restricted. 90 years after the events in question, the British royal family has decided that the public does not need to see the documentary record of what happened between the House of Windsor and the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 1940s. And now let us return to where we began, because the closing frame of this story is almost too strange to be believed if you encounter it without all the preceding context. Wallis Simpson outlived Edward, who died in 1972. She outlived the Abdication crisis. She outlived Ribbentrop, who was hanged in 1946. She outlived almost every major figure of that entire era. She died in Paris in April 1986, having spent her final years in what was described diplomatically as declining health, a medicated seclusion that kept her from speaking publicly for the last decade of her life. And when she died, she was buried at Frogmore, the royal burial ground at Windsor Castle, beside Edward. She is the only American citizen ever buried in the royal burial ground at Windsor. The woman who an FBI field report formally classified as a German intelligence asset during the Second World War is buried in the most protected piece of royal ground in England, beside the man who abdicated the British throne, and the files that explain what she actually was to this country, and what she actually did, are locked in a castle 200 meters from her grave. Think about the Church of England angle for a moment, because it has never been adequately addressed. In 1936, Edward could not marry Wallis Simpson because she was a divorcee, and the Church of England, of which he was supreme governor, could not sanction such a union. That is the constitutional position that forced the abdication. And yet in 2005, Prince Charles, heir to the throne, supreme governor of the Church of England in waiting, married Camilla Parker Bowles, herself a divorcee. The ceremony was civil rather than religious, yes. The Archbishop of Canterbury offered a service of prayer and dedication afterwards, yes. But the fundamental constitutional and theological objection that was used to force Edward from the throne did not prevent his great-nephew from doing a version of the same thing 69 years later. The institution never explained this discrepancy. It simply waited until everyone who remembered 1936 was dead or too old to make a fuss, and then quietly allowed what it had once called impossible. Because that is what institutions like this do. They do not resolve contradictions. They do not release files. They do not answer questions. They outlast the people asking them. They wait. They restrict. They redact. and they rely on the passage of time to transform a cover-up into a historical curiosity, and a historical curiosity into something no one bothers to investigate anymore. But here is what cannot be waited out. The FBI memo is real. The Hardinge note is real. The Marburg Files are real, even in their partially suppressed state. Andrew Morton's 2015 book, 17 Carnations, drawing on declassified material from both the FBI and MI5, is rigorously sourced and has not been successfully challenged in the decade since publication. The flowers were real. The number 17 was recorded by a source with direct knowledge of the British royal family. The declassified FBI report sent to J. Edgar Hoover is a primary source document accessible to anyone who cares to look for it. What is also real is the silence. The files at Windsor Castle that remain sealed. The wartime correspondence that has, as far as historians can establish, never been fully recovered. The gap between what the declassified record strongly implies and what has ever been officially acknowledged. Wallis Simpson may have been a Nazi intelligence asset. She may have been a vain, ambitious woman who kept dangerous company and said things she should not have said to people she should not have trusted. She may have been something in between. The honest answer is that we do not know. And we do not know because the people who do know have spent 90 years making sure that we cannot find out. 17 flowers were delivered to a flat in Marylebone every morning in 1936. 10 years later, the man who sent them stood in the dock at Nuremberg and was condemned to death for crimes against humanity. He was hanged on October 16, 1946. The woman who received those flowers was buried 40 years after that in the royal grounds at Windsor Castle. And the file, the actual, complete, unredacted file that would tell you what passed between them, what she knew, what she passed on, and what the British state did to cover it up, that file has never been opened to the public. If this is the kind of history that you think people deserve to know, share this video. The algorithm does not favor uncomfortable truths unless real people push them forward. And if you have not already, subscribe, because we are just getting started, and there is a great deal more that the palace would prefer you never found out.